So in Unit 4, we're going to start looking at more of the user interface controls and also different models for how we organize the interface. There's a couple common patterns. One's called ModelViewPresenter. Uh, the other ones are called ModelViewController, MVC, and ModelViewViewModel. So we'll talk a little bit about those and kind of implement one. Ours, they're all similar. Ours tends to follow the model view presenter model, I guess closest. Um, First, let's talk a little bit about interfaces. We'll be doing some more with interfaces, I mean, not UI widgets and that sort of stuff. Just don't have that much time to delve into each user interface widget and how you might use a checkbox or a spinner and that sort of stuff. So I'm going to link you into some, and then hopefully you can see and learn quickly from these. There's this user Google interface area, this user interface idea, and under that are some of the common input controls. So buttons we've already looked at, and we'll return to buttons next in the next unit. But checkboxes and radio buttons and spinners are the three things we're going to be using in this assignment. And again, I'm not going to go into too much detail. So if you've never used checkboxes or radio buttons or like any sort of a list in any other environment, you might want to look at them here. But there's a lot of overlap from one area to another, so I'm not going to go into too much detail for those. And here's the links directly to the spinner stuff. What I do want to do is talk a little bit about some of these design patterns for setting up your user interface system, including this model view controller or model view presenters. I've got a couple links here to two articles which I think are fairly good explanations of them from an Android point of view. This first one is from Android Pub. Talks about the model view controller system. So in this system we have a data model where we hold our data. We have a view and we have a controller. This is our user interface and this is our system. When we later on when we working on our assignment, we'll do a pizza ordering system, and so this will be kind of our view and our layout, and our activity generally is in here. And then we'll have a pizza ordering system that will handle orders, but it'll also deal with a pizza and an array list of pizza. We don't have a database yet. We're not working with databases. So right now our data model will be relatively simple, but this will be our data model up here, and we'll work on this. In this sort of model view controller, things can talk to each other directly without what we call interfaces in place, and the model is sometimes used directly by the view to control or access things for this. So that's our model view controller, and you might want to read through the descriptions of those. Now, very similar to this is the model view presenter. So again, we've got our data model out here. We have our user interface, our view, and then rather than a controller, we sometimes call this a presenter. One of the main things that's different in the presenter is that we're usually only working with interfaces back and forth. So like it says here, unlike the view and control, the view and presenter are completely decoupled from each other and communicate only through interfaces, and that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at, in this unit is using interfaces between those. Interfaces make it easier to swap out a different presenter to a view. So let's say we have a pizza ordering system here. We have our pizza model and our pizza ordering system. If we have an interface here, it's easier than to swap in an Android system view or like a web-based view in here, or different, because we've got an interface that we can just decouple these supposedly from. So that's one of the combinations, and that's why I would say we're implementing this system. Also, we tend to eliminate this model view connectivity. Although I'll mention one area in our example where we are, in our view, we're grabbing an enum type from the model in our view to use, and maybe that should have been defined in the interface. So, okay. We also have a model view model. We often see this like in Visual Studio, and C# uses a similar model. The main thing here is that our view model can be working with multiple different views here. There's a one-to-many relationship here. I'm not going to go into too much detail in this class on this. We're not going to really deal with that. So again, goes over this. Now, the Android implementation of this, this talks about some ways of implementing this. So we have a user, and then we have our view. This is our layout, and we're just using our XML file for our layout. But in more complicated systems, you would define a new class inheriting from one of these layout classes and base things on that. You also might have an activity here, and you might have a controller. We're going to actually, to keep things simple, we're going to combine our activity and our controller here. Well, yeah, I guess no. Well, it depends on how you look at things. We're going to kind of do. So I guess what I'm going to say is we're going to combine our activity with our view. This view and activity. Our activity is going to be, because we're not going to define a custom inherited view. So our activity is going to work with the XML file as our view. And then we're going to use our controller here to access this ANA data model. And again, this is usually a database interface, and we'll see this later on when we get to using databases with these systems. But for now, this will just be a simple class that'll handle the data out there. Okay. And so this talks about some things, reasons for creating a separate controller class that's not tied to this. And one of the ideas is to keep this stuff separate from the controller. So again, you can swap out the Android components and not have your controller have any Android specifications in it, and certainly your data model won't. So this is all non-Android Java, and then this is Android portions here, and then you can swap things in and out. Okay. So you might want to, again, I find this article very good to read. I suggest you go over that in more detail. And here's another one that goes over the same things, kind of talking about it in a different way and how it's represented. And again, talks about the model view controller setup and how we can interact with things. And again, with our view and our controller, we have some information going back and forth here, and it actually gives you some code that walks you through some of this. And again, the model view model view presenter. And again, one thing we're going to see here is that the presenter is not tied to the view just through an interface. So we're communicating just through an interface here. So we have an interface between our view and our presenter. And so here we have the view has a tic-tac-toe view interface, which the presenter uses, and the presenter has a presenter interface with the view uses. And this, again, this is a system we'll be setting up and using in our systems. So again, some sample codes here. Feel free to review that. So that's our layout here. Now let's look at a sample. We're going to look at a tip calculator. We looked at the tip calculator, I think, last time. We're going to look at that same sort of setup here to do this. Now, in this unit, and starting now, we're going to be using GitHub for most of our assignments. GitHub is a cloud-based storage location for code and other things. So we'll be starting to use that. It also relies on a program called Git, G-I-T, which is a source control system that tracks changes to your code and creates different versions of your code, so you can look back as you've changed things and see what's been changed when and that sort of stuff. And so Git and GitHub works together. GitHub is a website out there. So I forgot to post the links here, but again, before I can download this assignment, I'm going to need a GitHub account. And right away in the participation activities, your first thing is to create a GitHub account. You can just create a free account. They're all free, but there is a special student account if you have a .edu address, which you will with St. Scholastica. It gives you a bunch of things, including a nice little better version of a GitHub free account. So somehow sign up for a free GitHub account here. Again, if you're on a Windows PC or something like that, you're going to need our Mac, Probably Windows. You'll need Git installed on most Unix systems. I think on Mac systems Git is installed by is already there, but on Windows it might not. So you may have to go here and install Git and um, find out what it is. There are different downloads for different systems, um, and I usually just do the basic Windows install about that. So. Okay, so let's assume that you've set up GitHub or you've created a GitHub account, you've gone to the student pack, um, and you've entered your information, got your GitHub account. And again, you get access to some of this other stuff, but that's the main thing that we're going to use here. And so now we're going to grab this, download this project and look at it. You don't actually have to do this one here. You're certainly going to have to do this one for the assignment, but if you want, you can grab this one and look at it on your own. Otherwise, I'll just bring it up here and show you how. So I'm just going to go into Android Studio. I'm going to go down to the third option, check project out from, and I'm going to choose GitHub. So it may ask you to log into GitHub here. Now it's going to ask me for a GitHub repository URL, and so I have to get that. So what I do is I use GitHub Classroom, which creates copies of code that I create for assignments for you automatically. So I can go here, and it will create an assignment here for you. Here's the Unit 4 sample tip calculator, and here's the assignment URL. I can copy that. Also, I can go there and look. This is a typical repository. It shows the code here. And so at this level, this is the same URL as I just copied. So I could also copy that URL. It has code here, so I can actually go through and find the code and look at it. So I can look at the actual code here. And it actually tracks, oops, too far. It tracks the commits or the work that you've done on this project. So when you make changes, it'll track all these changes. So here's the changes I've made to this. And I can actually look at any one of these and see the exact changes that I've made, what I've added in green, and what is it sort of replaced and things like that. So I can see all the changes that I've made. And when you work on this, this is what I will see. I will see your full code and also the changes you've made to the code. Okay, but I've grabbed this URL here. Grab this URL. Now I go back to Android Studio. I'm going to paste in the URL here. Again, I might want to set where it's going to be stored and what its name is. I'm going to then clone. Clone will make a copy from GitHub onto my system, and then it says, do you want to open it? And yes, I do want to open that. So there might be some questions about updating things. Generally, you can just update where it asks. Let me switch this. It may also warn you about some things. Sometimes they'll pop up errors. If you just wait a little bit, Git will build these. Sometimes there are extra files. It asks you want to delete them. That some extraneous files in the Git project, and you can usually just delete those. But hopefully it'll just build. Again, sometimes if it's using an older build system, it may ask you to download certain things, but I will try to keep it so that the tools will be use modern tool. The current systems, you won't have to download anything more for this. So now I'm going to go into the project here. I like to view this in, and I'm viewing this in the Android format, not the project format, because I just find it easier to track things. And let's go into the code, the Java code. I can skip the testing stuff for now. And here's my programs. We have a main activity and a tip calculator activity. So the main activity is the program that is tied to the user interface. And this is what we've been working in before. It handles the edit text and text views, and now it's going to handle some combo box or some combo radio buttons and that sort of stuff. And previously we've been putting a lot of our code, in here, and it's not uncommon for beginning programmers just to put their whole program in the activities. But when you get to more advanced programming, you want to move away from this. So now we've added this tip calculator interface that has a calculate button where we can give it a bill, the number of people, and a Boolean for a good service or not. And it'll take out the logic for how we calculate how it calculates the bill, the tip, and work on that. So let's go back here. So basically we have our main activity and we have our tip calculator as our two objects. And so the main activity is going to refer to the tip calculator, and tip calculator is going to refer back to the main activity in some ways. And again, we're going to define an interface between, and in fact, two interfaces going back and forth. So the main activity will use, there'll be a calculator interface that this will have to implement to access the calculator. And then an update view interface, which this will have to implement. This will have to implement so that we can then call it back. So these are our two interfaces. And again, this is kind of what differentiates a presenter from a controller, is whether or not you have interfaces here. So again, interfaces are just kind of a set of routines or methods that we define as ways for objects to communicate to each other. So here we have relatively simple interfaces. Let's go back to my project here. So I've got these two interfaces. The calculator interface, all it has is one method called calculate. It has a bill and number of people, and then good service, Boolean, true, false. So this is the only method. So if we're going to use the calculator, we'll call this method. Now this could return a value, and we could do that, but here we're making it void, so I'm using the other interface to go back and forth. So there's another interface, update view. So if I want to update the view in the main activity, I can call this, and this is going to send back a total tip and a tip per person, because there's going to be two things. One of the things where I could return one value here, that might be okay, but again, I'm going to return two values. I'm going to calculate the tip per person and the total tip, return two things. So and just to show you how these two views work, it's kind of an arbitrary, but I'm setting up these two interfaces here that work back and forth. So our main activity gets created, and we are going to declare a calculator interface here and call that our tip calculator. So again, we're going to use this interface for this. But when we instantiate that interface down here, we're going to say new tip calculator. So tip calculator is going to, here, public class tip calculator, is going to implement this interface. That interface just has one method, a calculate method, so we're going to have to make sure our tip calculator implements that method. So here's our implementation method for that. So we're doing that. So our main activity creates a tip calculator that implements this interface. Let's see, yeah, implements this calculator interface. Similarly, our tip calculator is going to want to talk back. So again, if we remember when we were, let's go down. So when we have our presenter and view, our view started up and created the presenter. And again, right now we don't really have a data model in this one. In the assignment, we'll add that to this, but here we're just working with this thing. Our view, our activity here is creating our tip calculator. And so it can send messages to that, but we also need the presenter to be able to communicate back to the view. So we need to set that up. So in this case, we have another interface here. And so when we create our tip calculator, we're going to pass a reference to this object, our main activity, to the tip calculator. Now, so when we look at our tip calculator, when we have the constructor, there's just one parameter, and that's an update view interface. So again, this is our interface here that we have. So this is really an activity, but we're looking at it through the lens or the view, the template of an interface, the update view interface. And that just has one method, update view. So in order for this main activity to fulfill the requirements of the interface, we've added the implements the update view interface here. And then we've added the update view method. So it's got to have this method in it, which this interface defines. So when we create the tip calculator, we pass a reference to this activity. So the tip calculator gets that and just saves it into a link to the main view. So it has a main view object, but it's defining it through this interface. So again, there's no code in here referring this to an Android activity. Even though it is an Android activity, we've buffered between this interface. So again, we've got these interfaces defined in here. So the main activity is going through the calculate interface to the tip calculator, which this implements. And then the tip calculator sends information back through this update view interface, which the main activity implements. Hopefully you've seen interfaces and this sort of stuff before. If not, you might want to take some time and go through this and see if you can understand how this two-way communication works and how it's set up. Basically, it's set up through our two constructors here. So in our main activity, we create a tip calculator and pass some information through there. And then in here, we call that constructor and save that. Now notice then, how does this work when we're doing, so then when we click like the calculate button, all we're doing is we're converting things from like strings to doubles here, doing some user interface things, but not doing any of the logic of calculating a tip. Again, we're checking if a radio button is checked. So we're assuming that, so let's look at the user interface. So under resources, layout, here's our user interface. So one thing I've seen sometimes is I've seen problems where I get this, it'll tell me action bar overlay, or it gives a rendering error. If I look at my errors up here, it'll be a render problem. And so that's usually tied to the theme here. And so if you see something like that, what you can do is just change the theme. By default, it's tied to app theme, and for some reason that's not always built. So if you just switch that to, like I often just been using Material Light theme and switch it to that, then it should just change the theme up here. Then it should be able to render this correctly. So if you see that problem again, just try changing the theme for that. Okay, so here we have our layout, and we have these radio buttons, and we have a checkbox. We have a button here. And so in our main activity, we are declaring variables for some of this text, some variables for our 3 radio buttons and our checkbox service. So we're declaring variables for all those. We've seen how to do that with edit text and text views, but this is, I think, the first time you've done some of this checkboxes and radio buttons. So we declare them up here, and then again, down in our onCreate method, we have to tie them to the XML file. So again, okay, like we have an edit text field, and I'm abbreviating this right now, ET bill for edit text bill, and I'm going find view by ID and going out and finding the edit text field out here. So the bill amount is right here. It's edit text bill, and I'm accessing that in my main activity here. Similarly with these text views, we've seen those before. Define view by ID and going r.id and finding that. So this is tying these Java variables to these spots in there. Similarly for our checkbox and our radio buttons, I have my checkbox for the service and my radio buttons here. And those are tied to specific views out here. So I have a radio button or a checkbox. And again, I've just gone into widgets and grabbed the checkboxes or the radio buttons here. So, and so those are all set up here and should be working fine. Okay, and then I have when I click on the button, I have this code run, and so I'm going to grab the bill amount as a double. And so this is all what I call Android code. Like, I've got to go out to the edit bill text view. I've got to get the text and convert it to a string, and then I'm going to parse it to a double. So I end up with a double for the bill. Same with the number of people. I'm going to assume it's 1, and then I'm going to check if radio button 2, if they've checked 2 or 3. Interesting, I don't have those in the right order. If 2 or 3 is selected, I'm going to change the number of people. So again, this is some of the user interface stuff. And then I'm ready to calculate the bill. So I'm going to call my tip calculator, which I defined up here as a tip calculator object through this interface. And I'm going to say calculate bill and provide it the bill amount, the number of people. Well, I'm actually just going to grab in the checkbox, checkbox.is checked is Boolean, so I can pass that directly as a parameter here. So that'll go here, and we'll calculate the bill. So I'll calculate the tip, total tip, and the tip per person. And now I'm going to update that. I'm going to update that view here. So I'm going to call my main view.update view and pass in those back. So again, that's using this. So I use the calculate, and inside calculate, I'm calling update view to go back to the main activity and update the fields there. So update view in my main activity, I'm giving it a total tip and a tip per person, and it is then figuring out what text views to put those at and putting them in the right text views for this. So it's just a simple thing where I'm using these interfaces and defining this. So again, I don't have a real data architecture, but I do have this presenter view. The view is going to the user interface, and in this area I'd say my main activity is part of my view, and with that is this XML file that the main activity works with, and the tip calculator is my presenter, or in the model view controller, this would be the controller. And again, I don't have a real data model in this one. I call this a presenter model because, again, all the communication through this is defined through these two interfaces. So I should be able to break the connection with these relatively easily and swap in something else because everything's defined through these interfaces. Okay, and then we'll go through the similar thing, actually a more complicated version in the participation activity and the assignments. We're going to look at a pizza ordering system. So hope you enjoy that.